You're listening to the Embrace Family Recovery podcast, a place for real conversations with people who love someone with the disease of addiction. Now here is your host, Margaret Swift Thompson.
Welcome back to the Embrace Family Recovery podcast. Today, I am honored to introduce you to Jaclyn Brown. Jaclyn is a sister who left corporate America to pursue her passion of reducing the stigma surrounding substance use disorder and drug use, empowering others to tell their stories, and changing the conversation around addiction, mental health, and harm reduction. Today, Jaclyn opens up about losing her younger brother to the disease of addiction, finding grief counseling, and the impact on Marc's death on her life. She also discusses being the eldest sibling and the way that role played out in her family. It's my privilege to introduce you to Jaclyn Brown.
The Embrace Family Recovery podcast.
First of all, welcome, Jaclyn. So happy you're here with me.
Thank you for having me.
It's kind of cool how the universe brings people together. You and I were on a summit together, and I got to hear you there. And so I feel like I know you a little bit, but I think it's going to be more fun to dive into this conversation together and see what we glean from it.
Yeah.
Whenever someone's on my show, I ask them who their qualifier is. Who is it in their life that introduced them to the world of recovery? And I was curious who you would say.
That is a really good question. Let me fluff the time with thank you for having me on. And I think the world of recovery for me is a little bit different in the sense of losing my brother, kind of like recovering from that loss. I'm not going to lie, what really helped me was my grief therapist. I started grief counseling about a month after my brother passed, and consistently going to sessions and talking through things and trying to unravel like what my life is now. She's the one who helped me honestly start to recover and understand that it's not going to be like this forever. And I know that's probably a really weird thing because I'm sure other people say other types of relationships, but it's the first time I'd ever gone to therapy. And so it was a lot for me to unpack in general. I like to think that I was very self-aware before therapy, but therapy definitely made me examine a lot of things and why I was holding so much maybe like anger and hatred in me. And so it really allowed me to start letting that go. And that has really been a huge piece in kind of like rebuilding my life back again.
No weird answers. How it comes out is how it comes out. I want to say, though, before we go any further, how sorry I am that you lost your brother.
Thank you.
Incomprehensible, right? I don't think unless someone's walked through that, can they possibly understand what that feels like.
Agreed.
And it's interesting that your recovery journey, and again, that doesn't have to look a certain way because everyone recovers their own way, started by allowing yourself to get help when you were probably at one of your darkest places, having lost your brother.
Absolutely. And that's absolutely what it was, because I felt like my family as a whole, all of us had been kind of just, it sounds terrible, waiting for that phone call or waiting for that other shoe to drop. And a friend of mine had lost her sister a year prior to substance-related issues as well. And she said, I would really encourage you to start grief counseling like as soon as possible. And coming from her, knowing she had lost her sister and what she had gone through, I'm like, okay, I'm going to actually take, because people will give you advice. When someone passes, everyone loves to give you advice on how to handle it. And coming from a fellow sibling, though, I was like, okay, she knows what I will need. So It really did help me a lot.
It's also not horrible to say that you were waiting for another shoe to drop or something bad or that call to happen, because I hear that from every family I work with. They are on pins and needles waiting for the worst case scenario or the next trauma to happen.
Exactly. And it's one of those things where even still, my brother, November 16th will be 5 years since he's been gone. And if I'm in a movie theater, I'll still have that weird, almost like a PTSD urge to check my phone every 15 minutes to see if I missed a call, or, all these like little things that you don't necessarily think about. Like, I hate it when someone calls me unexpectedly. Like, someone may think like, oh, I'm just going to pop in and say hi. It triggers that, oh shit, what's happening? And is this something bad? So people who like really get me, they'll text me ahead of time and go, hey, I need to talk to you about something good. Can I call you? And I'll do that with my sister as well. And it's funny how like those little behaviors still continue on even once that worst has happened.
And you bring up a really good point, Jaclyn. I think that one of the things that many families don't have words for until they're taught is triggers.
Yes.
They know what their loved ones' triggers are, or they assume they know what their loved ones' triggers are that return them to use or have them use more. But when I talk to them about triggers and we talk about sights, sounds, behaviors, and smells, mannerisms that instinctively go to that, my word, I haven't got a clinical term for it. And then the hairs on your neck are up and your heart rate's going and you're in.
Yes.
Those are true triggers as a result of substance use disorder being a part of the family, as a result of traumatic events happening in the family, can be as a result of receiving, in my case, a letter through the mail that was anonymous that brought me very bad news. To this day, a non-returned address letter.
Oh my gosh.
Decades later, I still get the slight, ooh, but it isn't near what it was in the beginning.
I know this is supposed to be an interview of me, but what did that letter say?
Yeah, it was a doozy. I was engaged to be married, and it informed me that my fiance was having anonymous sexual relations and was possibly HIV positive.
Wow.
Yeah. And, it is definitely going to be about you. But I think the point that I want to say is I, as a therapist, at that point, did not understand trauma and triggers, except when I went to military.
Yeah.
And that does not take away from the levels of trauma they experience at war and combat and military. That's a whole different level. But there is imprinted trauma from smells, behaviors, letters. And I just think it's so important for families to know that, because they don't.
No.
And to your point, 5 years later, which is just, it's 5 years, and yet it's only 5 years. And those are very real imprinted traumas that still have some hold.
Yeah.
And get you agitated or activated emotionally when you have them.
Yeah. And I think one of the big things that I have realized is that sometimes a trigger is not anything. Like, sometimes people think it's very obvious, like maybe someone mentions your brother's name or maybe whatever. And I remember I was in a grocery store, and it was July, so it was definitely unexpected. And a Christmas song started to play on the radio. They started to do like Christmas in July or something. And that, I was like, I need to get out of this store right now. I felt like that rush of, because that's my brother's favorite holiday. And so every time I hear any sort of Christmas music, it sets some certain songs really set me off. There was even a point where I think I was just going through to see like a weird experiment of like, what are my trigger songs and what are not. So then after that, I took a playlist from Spotify of like the best Christmas songs, and I was like playing, and I'm like, nope, can't listen, next. So I would know, because I was in that mode of like that hypervigilance, where I feel like I've been in a hypervigilant state for a very long time. But anything that I can like lessen danger, anything I can do to like prepare myself, like to the point where I'm just sitting and listening to Christmas songs in July, just in case, getting myself ready for December.
Jaclyn, I really admire and respect that quality in you, because a lot of people don't go after it like you chose to. And neither's right or wrong. You're right. Everybody does it their own way. But what I hear you saying is, I needed to do some experimentation with my own triggers once I realized how much I was triggered and how much it affected me, and then set some boundaries around them through spot lists that were changed. But I also want to go back to what you just said. People who know me know not to call me unexpectedly. And people who know me will text first, and I will do it with my sister. That is such a beautiful boundary to give your nervous system rest.
Yes. And what I had not realized is that, again, going through, because grief counseling evolved into regular therapy, which, it evolved into, we've been doing marriage counseling because the impact that grief had on our marriage. And then I'm in EMDR right now. And so it's something where I kind of attributed everything back to my brother's substance use. And when he first got into his car accident, which he was hit by a drunk driver back in 2020, was ejected from his vehicle, and he was in a wheelchair for about 2 months. And in that time, that's when they gave him oxycodone. And up until that point, he had always experimented with drugs. Like, weed was a big thing for him, which I didn't really care about. But what I did not realize is that he had been experimenting with opioids because someone had access to it. But the accident really pushed it over the edge. And so I related all of my hypervigilance or trauma or whatever back to this. And about a year into grief counseling, I brought up, I said, yeah, well, I feel like I'm still kind of mad at my brother for, when my house got broken into. And she was like, how have you never brought this up? And I said, well, nothing happened to me. And she was like, but your house was broken into? And I was like, yeah. And I was at home when they broke in. And I said, but I wasn't hurt, so I was fine. And she's like, were you fine? And it was the first time I had went, oh, maybe that was traumatic, because like you had mentioned, PTSD, CPTSD had been reserved for people in the military and people who had gone through really, really horrific things. And in 2010, before my brother's accident, I was home by myself. I lived with my brother and a couple of his friends as roommates. And I heard this pounding sound. And my brother and his friends were out of town. They had gone back to our hometown, which is about an hour away. So it was like a Tuesday night. And all of a sudden I hear this pounding sound. And I'm like, what is that? And I'm kind of wake up from my sleep. And my bedroom door was kicked open by someone. And as soon as I saw that, and mind you, in my head as a woman, I've always thought, if someone tries to attack me, I'm going to have scissors by my bed to stab. So, I'm thinking of all these things, and I had all these things near my bed, to hit someone or whatever. And I just froze, and I had zero idea what to do. I heard people running in the house. And so the next thing I did was grab my cell phone. And my first thought was, should I really call 911? Like, is this an emergency? Because how much we doubt our own trauma or our own situations when you become I'm a very parentified oldest child, and I don't like to ask for help. I hate asking for help. So I called 911, and I'm bracing myself against my bedroom door. And they're like, okay, do you see the lights outside? The cops came very quickly. And they said, do you see lights outside your house? And I said, yeah, I do. And they're like, I'm going to need you to run to your front door. And I said, I can't do that. Like, I don't think I can. She's like, if it's a direct shot, I just need you to go so they can clear the house. So I ran out my front door. The cops came, cleared everything out. They had stolen so much from my brother's room. And from what I could tell, this was someone who had clearly been to our house before, just because they went straight for my brother's room, and the logic of the way that they broke into the house, my room should have been first. But when I got back in the house, like, there was a knife outside the hallway of my room. And I remember not being able to truly process it, because I was okay. I was not physically harmed. None of my stuff was stolen. And when you tell that to people or the cops there and everyone's reaction was so glad you're okay, I'm like, yeah, I'm okay. But I then shove that away. I'm very good at dissociating and compartmentalizing things. And I shoved that away, and I didn't realize that that was the start of where a lot of my anxiety and hypervigilance really came from, was that incident. But I just assumed, like, oh, I just really like to be prepared. I just, because I didn't think I was worthy of being traumatized, if that makes any sense, because nothing happened to me.
This podcast is made possible by listeners like you.
When I reflect on my decades of work with families of people with the disease of addiction, I have seen few siblings get the same resources provided to partners, parents, or even children. Numerous siblings have told me they felt they couldn't share in traditional Al-Anon or Nar-Anon meetings as the parents' and partners' pain seemed so much more significant. The Embrace Family Recovery Coaching Group for siblings will meet for 6 group sessions this summer, including education on the no-fault disease, connecting with other siblings so feeling less alone, strategizing together regarding communication, boundary setting, and more. The summer course for siblings begins Tuesday, the 16th of July. The group is for people 16 years and up, and the total cost for the 6 sessions is $180. To find out more, head to my website, embracefamilyrecovery.com, and click the Work with Margaret page. Go down to coaching groups, and you will find sibling groups. Click on that to learn more about this group and how to register.
You're listening to the Embrace Family Recovery podcast. Can you relate to what you're hearing? Never miss a show by hitting the subscribe button. Now back to the show.
I also wonder, and this could be a whole different discussion, gender roles.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned eldest.
Yes.
There's a lot of factors in there. I also, as a woman, had an attempted burglary. And I was fine. They didn't get in the house. I screamed and they jumped. They caught them. This was a serial offender. And it was like, okay, now I go to lunch.
Yeah, right. You just move on.
Yeah. And I think it goes to a lot of what you said. Not comfortable asking for help. For me, it wasn't comfortable being vulnerable. It was got to pull it together. It's my MO is to keep going and help everyone else, So it's really interesting to have you bring that up and have that memory and realize, yeah, didn't even do anything about that one.
Right. Exactly. And the ways that it would manifest, I didn't even correlate them together because I just thought, like, I'm just really prepared now. I just really want to know all the details of every place that I'm going to. I want to know where the exits are. I want to know. And it wasn't until a year into grief therapy where I started to unpack my own stuff, which I had. Again, when you're the eldest, you just need to get things going, or you need to just move forward. We'll deal with it later. And then sometimes later is when you're 39 and you're sitting with your therapist.
And you got there. And that's what's so important. How you got there, when you got there, I think is so important to give ourselves grace, and everyone listening grace, that it is going to take what it takes. A lot of us, our survival skills serve us really well until they don't.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
So you shared that you'd never been to therapy before the grief counseling. And what a gift that you found someone in your life, or someone came into your life where you're willing to be vulnerable with someone who had been through what you were going through.
Yeah.
And that you were able to listen to their suggestion. There had to have been experiences around his use that impacted you prior to the sadness of losing him, the tragedy of losing him. Was your family a family that talked about it? Was your family one that denied it? Was your family one that sought services for him, but not everybody else? How did that go in your family? Because you're the oldest, so you have a different perspective than, say, the youngest would.
That's a great question, because I do think that my birth order does play a role in this. And I actually found out about my brother's substance use from a friend of his. A friend of his called me and said, "Hey, I really need to talk to you about Marc. Like, this is really escalated. And now it's like," he was saying, like, we all used to do it to party and whatever. He's like, but now it's on another level with him. And he was confiding in me because I was friends with him too. And it's my brother's friend. And it's kind of a weird thing to go and tell someone's parents. So who's the default? The cooler, older sister. And when I was told that information, I just froze. I just sat with it because I didn't know what to do. I called my brother and made it seem like I was just checking in on him. And he was like, "Oh, I'm good. Like, what's been going on?" And I'm like, okay, like, is it really that bad? So then you get into that, is it really that bad? Like, is it terrible? But then it got to a point where he ended up, his accident happened. He was a junior in college and he tried to go back to school later on in the fall, and he pulled out because he wasn't doing well. So he moved back home with my parents, and I started asking them, like, "Do you notice anything different about him or anything like that?" "Oh, well, he's in his room, or he hangs out with his friends a lot, or he's hanging out with different people." I'm like, okay. So I'm kind of like keeping this mental tally of like, okay, things that are different. But then eventually another friend came to me and said, "Hey, like, this is a lot. Like, you need to talk to him." So I remember I told my sister, and we went to him, and we were the first ones to approach the subject. And I remember going into his room, all the blinds were drawn, everything's very dark, and it's noon, and I remember telling him, I said, "Look, I know that you're using drugs, and like, I want you to know, like, I'm here for you, and if you want to talk about this, we can talk about it." And my sister's the youngest, and she kind of was like the observer, just kind of see how it plays out. And he said, "I'm really trying to stop. Like, I don't want to be like this. Like, I have it under control. Like, don't worry about it." And having zero prior experience to any substance related anything, I went, okay. Because my brother was intelligent. He was very smart, very charismatic, very self-aware, probably more self-aware than I was at his age. And I was like, okay, he's got it. Like, I have no reason to not trust him otherwise. And then it just continued to spiral more. And it eventually got to the point where I had to tell my parents, and that's a hard conversation, but also telling them from the point of view of, don't react like, like I just startled you. Like, we need to figure out how to do this. But probably the biggest thing that really impacted it was I decided it would be a great idea to do an intervention, because I watched intervention. So I thought, you know what, at this point, because I think, my parents were starting to get really fed up with some of the behaviors. And I said, well, let's just do an intervention. Like, I saw it, like, I know how it goes. Here I am, big sister, and my parents were the ones coming to me. How should we handle this? And then you have his friends coming to me. What should we do? So everything is on me to solve this situation or to fix this situation. And doing this intervention was the worst idea that I could have ever done.
You run it? Like, you did it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
And mind you, it was just more so in the sense of, you have to go to treatment or you have to leave. And it got very ugly, very ugly. And my brother, went into, let's attack everyone here. And I don't think you're allowed to tell me what to do when, at the time I had gotten a DUI a couple years ago. He's like, I don't think you're allowed to tell me anything, considering you. And then I felt, that is pretty fucking hypocritical of me to do that, to say that. And then I realized, but I'm the oldest and I learned from that. So, I know better than you. Either way, what ended up happening is that a lot of the conversation stayed within our family. It's not like any of us, I have a Filipino mom, I have an Irish dad. So it's like, in those cultures, you keep things close. You're not sitting there and talking about it. And back in, 2014, 15, around there, it still wasn't something that you would go on Facebook and go, hey, anyone else's brother dealing with heroin? Like there wasn't that outlet. And anytime I Googled heroin addiction, it was detox rehab. So I assumed, well, this is the only way. So we discussed it within the family. My parents really relied on me to figure out what's the next step. What should we do? Because I was so close with my brother. And then my brother was very anti, anyone telling him what to do. So it was a really hard balance within our family, because I always felt like the pressure, and it was never implied, but just I internalized this pressure to save him or get him better.
It wasn't implied, but there is obviously a role you hold in your family that even his friends knew.
Yes.
You were the go-to person to get things done. And it's a burden.
It is.
It's a burden that many family members find themselves in and don't even look twice at what that impact's been on them.
Yeah.
There's no one person who can save another person, can change their behavior. But in the dire moments, that feels like the only option. I've got to do something. And it is no surprise to me, knowing a person with substance use disorder, having treated many of them, that your brother in the height of his disease had the most amazing way to be manipulated by his disease to turn it on everybody else, because that's what addicts do when they're active in their disease. The disease is in charge. It is telling them what to think, what to do, how to act, how to push away, how to keep everyone from getting in the way.
Exactly.
And you guys were beat up by his disease in that moment.
Exactly. And it was something where, that ended with, fine, screw you guys, I'm moving to Phoenix. And I lived in Phoenix at the time. I'm going to go live with friends who actually get it. And I don't need to be here. And I ended up calling out of work for a couple of days because that whole interaction just destroyed me. Like, I thought like this was my chance. And now things are going to get worse. And he did end up moving to Phoenix, but after a couple months, like, he was sober. And there was a point where we finally met up and we went out to dinner. And me, my sister, my husband, and him, it was like we're back together again.
He was back. It wasn't his disease.
Exactly. And it was just like, and mind you, again, this is before I even knew harm reduction was a concept.
Right.
Like, he's having a beer, and I'm not thinking anything of it, because in my head, the thing that makes everything chaotic and bad is the heroin. So if he's using cannabis or he's using alcohol, I know how he is with those and he's fine. So I had zero, like, are you really? So I didn't even question it. I was just like, I'm so glad you're in a good spot. But I think, as we all know, that cycle eventually starts again. And he was in and out of sobriety and went to treatment, attempted treatment a couple of times. The first time that he went was because we got into an argument at like day before Thanksgiving. And then I don't know if anytime I go back home, it's a small town. Everyone goes to the same bar the night before Thanksgiving, like, oh, it's a big reunion. And I hadn't talked to my brother actually in a couple months at that point because, again, me not understanding that it's the disease, I'm thinking he's just being a jerk. And like, I don't want to talk to him.
Sure.
But then, I come home and things are like normal. It's just kind of what it is. It's like, I'm not going to willingly talk to you. If you reach out to me, I'll talk to you, but I'm just not in the mood right now. And we went out to this bar and I said, I'm not very good at like tactful times to bring up situations. So we're catching up and I was like, I'd really love for you to go to treatment. He's like, we can't talk about this right now. And I'm like, no, but like, you don't get it. Like, I feel like I know you said that you have to want to go, but also like pulling back from this, I did not understand how forcing someone or giving them ultimatums was not helpful for him. I understand that now, but back then I was just like, why wouldn't you take this opportunity? Why wouldn't you want this? But eventually there was a lot of back and forth yelling. And then I just finally yelled, I don't want you to die. I cannot have you die. And I think when I said that, he was like, okay, I'll try it out. And I'm thinking, here we are, like, yay, this is going to be so great. And like, I was leaving the following week on my honeymoon. And so I'm thinking, I'm going to come back from my honeymoon. He'll be in treatment. It'll be like the first day or two. I'll come visit him because he was going to go to treatment in Phoenix. And since he was over the age of 26, he was no longer covered under my parents' insurance. He was covered under state Medicaid. So at day 13, they said, we're not going to pay anymore. You can stay. You can continue to stay and pay out of pocket. I think it was like $1,500 a day, which who has that? But I would visit him every night. You know, there would be like the visitation hours and we talked through what he had learned, you know, in the day. And then he said, well, I can't stay. I'm just going to go back home. And I'm like, no, you cannot go back home. So I went to my husband and I was like, I know this is a lot. I know we just got married. Can he move in? And my husband loves my brother. My brother always wanted a brother. So like, he was like, absolutely. And for 2 months, my brother was in a great spot, lived with me. And again, I had my brother back, you know. He's still drinking alcohol, smoking weed, but no opioids, nothing else. And it was amazing to have him back and to have him be so, at this point, examining why he's doing the things that he's doing and becoming very self-aware. And we're having these really deep discussions. And we got into an argument over something small. And he said, well, I'm just going to like go home to like mom and dad's this weekend and I'll be back. And then never came back. Mm. And that was 2015. And he went, he did attempt rehab a couple more times. But of course, my dad said, hey, if you go, I'll buy you this, you know, as us and families do. We'll do anything to get them. Like he was promising him concert tickets and promising him these things. But my dad is one of those people who, I mean, that's really where I learned unconditional love from is he's like, I'm never going to let him out on the street. I'm never going to kick him out. He was very hesitant with my intervention idea to begin with. And he was probably the one person who was not on board with it.
But to your point, he did his way, you did your way. All of you are just trying to save your brother.
Exactly. And there is no, at the time, there's no support that I was aware of for family members. Again, coming from a small town, a very small Republican town. So it's anybody who uses drugs is demonized and they're terrible and they're this and that. So then I really don't want to talk openly about it. But it wasn't until he passed that I finally said, well, the worst has happened. So I'm not going to stop talking about it because I felt it was the elephant that nobody could ignore anymore. And for me, what sparked me to speak out was seeing the reaction on social media, which I feel like a lot of people don't think about. I got the call from my mom on the 16th. And I think a lot of people know if they get that call, there's a certain tone and pitch. And yeah, she had that and she was just sobbing and crying. And I just knew just by the tone of it. And by the time I had drove back home, so it's a 3-hour drive from Phoenix to my parents' house, I was already getting messages on social media saying, oh, I'm so sorry about your brother. And I'm like, how the hell do these people know about this? Small town. Everyone knows where my family lives, where my brother lives. They see ambulances. There are people who were friends that work within the police department, the fire department, whatever it may be. So imagine like I get the call and an hour later, I'm getting a text from someone. What if I had not spoke with my family? You know, like all of these things that I'm now seeing on his Facebook, like, I can't believe you're gone. Other people being like, what happened? And I just see this unraveling happening of here's this secret that if you knew us, if you were close to, us, it's not something we would deny, but here's this thing that we've never openly talked about that everyone's just blasting now. And not having control of that narrative was hard, because there were a lot of people who he had used drugs with, that he had helped, like wanted to help them get to sobriety. And so they were like, there were some people who were sharing their stories. Like 2 weeks ago, he was saying, yeah, you can do it. You can, like, I'm proud of you for being 2 weeks. Like, so here's like showing this really great side of him, but also showing he was, struggling with his own use. And it wasn't until I saw, because a lot of people were like, oh, what happened? Was it an overdose? Was it this? And just very, and then someone shared a picture of him, and then the hashtag underneath it said, and another one bites the dust. And I remember I was sitting in the parking lot of it was a Dillard's parking lot. Like, sometimes you just remember when you read certain things.
Mm-hmm.
My husband was inside picking out his funeral outfit. I had just got done picking out my brother's outfit that he would wear for his wake. And I read this and I was like, no, this is not how this goes down. And that is when my eulogy was my first piece of advocacy. And it was the first time that I spoke openly about it. And there was some pushback from my parents. And I said, Marc would not want me to lie about who he was. And I get that you're not comfortable with this, but I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to pretend that this didn't happen to us, or it didn't happen to us in the way that it did. But I really more so highlighted his life, what he had gone through, what we had gone through as a family, and telling people, I don't want you to remember him for the way that he died. Like, that doesn't define him. Yeah. Like, everything else that you knew about him, like, that was still there. We didn't see it that much in the final years, but it was still there. And it was very freeing to talk about it openly.
I'm always in awe of the courage of my guests, and Jaclyn is no exception. Listening to Jaclyn's story, I was struck by the levels of trauma experienced with her brother's substance use disorder and tragic death, including the added challenge of navigating social media. Come back next week, where Jaclyn continues to share her story and her passion for advocacy and education about harm reduction.
I want to thank my guest for their courage and vulnerability in sharing parts of their story. Please find resources on my website, embracefamilyrecovery.com. This is Margaret Swift Thompson. Until next time, please take care of you